Howdy folks, and welcome back. Apologies on the late video, been in a bit of a creative rut recently. Anyways, this is going to be the third in our trilogy going over how to write an ability. We first discussed the jargon issue, and then we got into what helps make a good character ability. If you haven't, I would highly recommend you watch at least the jargon video, as it'll help you give a framework for how to make your language more accessible to a wider audience. So, with that, let's get into this video's main topic, how to write a utility card's ability. So, what is a utility card? At its core, it's a supplemental card to your resources and creatures that is used to either give you an advantage, disadvantage your opponent, or augment play in some way. Advantage or disadvantage are incredibly broad terms, and that's sort of the point. Don't pigeonhole yourself into only allowing your utility cards to do one thing. Make sure you're exploring all sorts of different effects. Now, with that being said, it's important before you even start thinking of effects, what type of utility cards will you have, and how will they be played? With that, let's actually start with Pokemon, and I'll show you. In simple terms, Pokemon has supporters, trainers, and stadium cards. Now, before you grab your pitchforks and tell me I'm wrong, I recognize that since, 2013? The term trainers encompasses all utility cards minus special energies. These are then broken down into stadium supporters, items, Poketools, etc. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to use the terms supporter, trainer, and stadium, and you'll see why in a moment. In Pokemon, unless the card directly tells you, like Ultra Ball, you do not have to pay any resources to play any of these three types of cards. So Pokemon had to find a way to restrict the rules so as to not have 20-minute turns. Yu-Gi-Oh! If the card is a supporter, you may only play one supporter card per turn. The theory being that these should have stronger effects that, if used multiple times, would break the game. Stadiums follow a similar set of rules, but 1, a stadium card affects both players, and 2, if you play a stadium card on your turn, you cannot play a second one, and 3, there are only ever allowed to be one stadium card in play. So if one is played, the other is discarded. Trainers then, encompassing items, Poketools, etc., you can play as many as you want in a turn. Now, certain decks use this rule to an absurd level, which is where you get your 20-minute turns. It's great. As well, unless otherwise stated, you, the player, are unable to play any utility cards during your opponent's turn, unlike in, say, Magic, where you absolutely can be using instants during your opponent's turn. This style of quote-unquote free utility cards has its pros and cons, with the biggest negative, in my opinion, being that you can really drag out turns. On the flip side, I actually really like this style, as it means you can focus the resources of the game on the creatures, rather than kind of spreading it throughout the board. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got games like Flesh and Blood and Magic that have a resource-based utility card system. You have to pay a certain amount of something for the card's effect to work. For example, if you want to play X card, you have to use a certain amount of resources, whether that be action points for Flesh and Blood, or mana and or land cards for Magic. This requires that the player focus extensively on resource management. It also, usually, allows for players to use certain utility cards during your opponent's turn. If I'm being honest, this concept of playing cards during your opponent's turn, I understand is really well liked. That being said, it does require you to be sort of at attention the whole time. But in my personal opinion, I found it really messes with the flow of the game. And if your opponent is playing a deck that all it does is constantly just shut you down while you're trying to play, it's just not enjoyable. Just being honest here. I recognize this might be a hot take, especially for those of you who enjoy blue decks in Magic. It's just my personal 2 cents. Regarding Aquology, it will most likely be in the Pokemon format of the quote-unquote free utility cards, with a limit on what and how much you can play in a turn. Of course, we haven't even touched on attachments yet. As the name implies, these are cards that are attached to a specific creature or card and is meant to augment that specific damage, health, ability, whatever. How they are attached is no different than how any other cards would be played. That being the case, make sure there's some type of limiter on how many attachment cards one character can have. A prime example of this rule is in Gates of Amalgam. I had the rule that you could have up to 3 attachments on any one creature. The very first playtest I did with my opponent, they used Clay Doll 3 times on Headless Strongman, making it almost functionally immortal, as the Clay Doll would reduce damage by 2. So, let's do a little basic math here. 2 times 3 is 6. So now, to kill Headless Strongman, I had to do a minimum of 7 damage to get at least 1 damage on him. All the while, every creature that Headless Strongman kills, it gets +1 attack, and it just snowballs from there. Alright, so the first part is done. We now know the basic concepts of different types of utility cards. Now, let's talk effects. As I said at the beginning, a utility card is meant to either advantage the user or disadvantage the opponent. So, what happens when a creator has one too many Long Island iced teas? You get the supporter card Riley. Now, this card is a special kind of stupid, because it states that you, the player, reveal the top 5 cards of your deck. Your opponent then chooses 2, and you discard the other 3. Post-recording here, I read the ability slightly wrong, but I stand by what I say and I stand by my indignation. So not only are you taking the choice out of the player's hand and giving it to the opponent then basically gets to choose which cards get discarded, potentially ruining the original player's game plan. Sure, you could argue you just don't have the card in your deck, and I mean, fine, but the onus of responsibility should be on the creator for making such a brain-dead ability. Sorry. A better ability would be of, say, Rosie Ann's Research. This card allows you to search your deck for 2 in any combination of basic Pokemon or energy. It puts the utility in the player's hand and allows them to go through their deck to pick out certain cards they need. It also has the secondary effect of letting the player know what cards may be in their prize cards, and they can adjust their strategy as necessary. Aquology has no prize cards, so this secondary effect is irrelevant. See, the difference between the 2 cards is one allows the player to do something useful, while the other is hot freaking garbage that should have never been printed, and seriously, who thought of giving the opponent the ability to look at your cards, and then they get to decide what you discard? How is any of this a good idea? Dude was huffing some hard something that they were capable of making this card. Good God. Okay, now that my Pokemon bashing is complete, let's look at a few Aquology utility cards to help get a sense of what we're going to be looking at. In Aquology, there are 4 main utility card types: instants, modifications, persistence, and operations. A little on the nose, but naming isn't always my strong suit, clearly. Instances are, well, instant. You play them, do the effect, and discard the card. You can play as many as you want in a turn. This might change again with playtesting, but we'll see. Modifications are attachment cards. They're attached to a fish and give them some ability or they do something. Operations cards are more akin to Pokemon supporter cards in which they have stronger effects, but you're only going to be able to play 1 or 2 a turn. Finally, we have my favorite, persistence cards. These are cards that have effects that will constantly be in play unless they are removed from the field. The kicker is that each player has 2 persistence slots. Persistence cards, for example, can affect the player, the opponent, or both. For the most part, they will affect both players, allowing for a lot of different mechanics to come into play, but it also means a lot of playtesting to make sure things aren't horrifyingly broken. While names and art haven't been finalized because I am one person and have a short attention span, I'll give you an effect of a couple utility cards, starting with instant. So here it is. Flip a coin. If heads, remove all damage and special conditions from said fish. If tails, remove all damage and special conditions while also returning the fish and all mutagens back into your hand. The egg stays in play. This card has an upside no matter what happens, but it also has the potential downside of getting rid of your fish. Now, that doesn't mean it's a 100% downside. For example, let's say you have a 3 VP fish on the verge of death. This card, no matter what, would save you giving 3 VP to your opponent, as if they kill an egg, they only get 1. And if you just get rid of all the damage on it, well, then they can't kill it the next turn, potentially. Moving on to modifications. When attached to a fish that is attacking, flip a coin. If heads, the attack does its normal damage, plus add decay to the opposing fish. If tails, do not add decay. Now, decay is a type of status effect, but we'll get into status effects and when, how, should you have them in your game in a later video. We move on to operations. Discard your hand and draw 7 cards. A very simple operation card, but the ability to throw out your hand and get a new one is always going to be incredibly useful. And I think in most games that sort of have that Pokemon, Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh! Sense, you need to have a way to get rid of your hand in quick ways and get more cards. Gates' first couple of playtests actually struggled and the game slowed down to a halt because I hadn't thought about that and hadn't actually made any cards that allowed you to just chuck your hand and get more. And finally, we'll move on to persistence. Each player, once during their turn, may flip a coin. If heads, they may draw any mutagen card from the center resource pile. If tails, they must discard a mutagen card from their hand. This effect cannot be used if the player does not have a mutagen card in their hand. Now, I haven't talked much about the mutagen cards because it really deserves its own video. Mutagens are my resources, but unlike in most games, the resource cards are communal until discarded. They are, in all senses of the word, a finite resource. There are a few different mechanics I'm still working through, but I wanted to give this brief explanation so that the ability made a little bit more sense. And, well, there you have it. A brief overview of what makes for a good ability, plus some current ideas I have written down. Will they work? Honestly, who knows? But so long as you don't give your opponent the ability to discard your top deck with your cards, then, you really can't make a bad ability card. As always, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Peace!